Good morning, everyone. My name is Bill Edgar. I'm the president of the Central Valley Flood Protection Board, and on behalf of the board and the Department of Water Resources, I'd like to welcome you to the Coordinating Committee's regular meeting for the month of May 2020. Today's meeting is being conducted utilizing the WebEx platform. We very much appreciate your taking the time out of your schedules to join us this morning. We anticipate this meeting will be a light meeting with only one new item on the agenda, but we didn't think this would be an issue since there won't be any traveling time, and we will only take a part of your morning to discuss the subject that's on the agenda. If you don't mind, I'll establish some meeting protocols again, so we're all on the same page. First, Brian Jones, our board clerk, will be moderating these proceedings from a technical point of view. We'll operate the slides for today's presenters. He, as well as Kim and Leslie, will field comments and questions addressed to the presenters through the chat function on the platform, and those comments or questions emailed ahead of the board meeting, if there are any. Ryan will also be making some technical or operational comments after my introduction regarding how this will work. I want to do that, Ryan, just to make sure everybody who hasn't tuned into this before understands the platform a little bit. Second, following each presentation, I'll ask for questions or comments. Kim and Leslie will try to identify two people who've requested to speak or have submitted or emailed questions before the meeting. And I will then call on those two speakers, and we will repeat that process until we've exhausted all those who wish to speak. And finally, I just urge everyone to be patient and courteous, understanding this is new for us, and I'm sure there'll be a few glitches along the way. And I also know that everyone's very frustrated, probably tired and a little grumpy at this point because of this ordeal we're going through, but we have to deal with it. So let's do what we can to make these virtual meetings as pleasant as possible. Ryan, at this time, I'll turn it over to you to tell us the major features of the platform, as well as any technical things I've missed, so that the people who've joined in for this virtual meeting will know how to ask a question or make a comment when we get there. Ryan, I'll turn it over to you at this point.
Thank you. So I'll just reiterate, Kim sent out an email yesterday that addressed kind of the process that she wants to go through. She'd like for people to ask their questions after the presentation's over. And there's 3 ways you can do that. You can send her a text, you can email her, or you can privately message her through the WebEx app. And that's where I'll, show you how that's done. So third button from the left, it's going to look like a speech bubble, almost like a comic book bubble. You can click that and it'll open up a chat box where it'll give you the option to chat with everyone or privately to Kim. And so once you type in Kim's name, you can search her and request your question. Or like I said, you can text her or email her as well. And one last thing would be, everyone's doing a great job of it right now, but you were muted upon entry of the meeting, and we ask that until you're called upon to ask your question or present, we ask that you remain muted. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. Okay, let's start. We have, if you have your agenda before you, we are starting off with administrative matters. First item is introductions, and my understanding is that the platform keeps track of who logs in and who doesn't and who wants to talk and so on. So I don't think it's necessary to proceed with a roll call. The meeting call protocols, we think we've gone over. If you have any questions along the way, please let us know. We don't have any handouts at this time, but we do have one slide presentation, I guess, that Ryan will take care of. And we have a standing item on the agenda, which is anything on the SSJD Assessment District Feasibility Study Update. Leslie, or I don't know whether Ruth is on the line. Do we have any update regarding the SSJD at this point?
Thank you, Mr. President. Ruth is on the line, so I'm going to turn it over to her.
Thank you.
Good morning, President Edgar, members of the board. So I'm just going to provide a brief update. As most are aware, the board's conducting a feasibility study to determine the feasibility of reutilizing the SSJDD assessment district to provide funding for ongoing costs of the flood management system. So currently we're in the stakeholder outreach phase of the study. To date, the team has met with 5 stakeholder groups. In addition to we presented at a board meeting in April, and the May workshop was dedicated to the SSJDD feasibility study. We are in the process of scheduling additional meetings with the San Joaquin region stakeholders as well as the Farm Bureau representatives. And the goal of these meetings is to inform stakeholders of the overall scope of this study, as well as gain feedback on potential services to be funded by the assessment that will help guide the beneficiary analysis of the study. So I'm not sure if Kim Floyd had anything she wanted to add.
No, I think that covers it, but if there are those on the line who haven't received an invite to a stakeholder meeting and you'd like to participate, please email me or Ruth or both of us, and we'll make sure you're included.
Thank you. President Edgar, that's all I had.
Okay, thanks, Ruth. That's helpful. Let's move on to item 3, our new items on the agenda. And the first and only item is the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan 2022 Risk Analysis Update. Mary Jimenez and Steve Cowden from DWR and Nathan Pringle from HDR will have this report. And Mary, I didn't see you logged in, but do you want to introduce this item if you're there?
Morning. Can you hear me, President Edgar?
I sure can. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you. Yes, I'm here today. I wanted to make sure before I start, is Steve Cowden and Nathan Pingle also logged on?
Steve Cowden's here. Nathan Pingle here.
Thank you, guys. Mary, I think we can proceed with your introduction anyway, or overview.
Okay. Ryan, are you going to pull the slides up or would you like me to do so?
I was going to give you presentation access right now. So,
Okay.
one moment, please.
I'll be ready.
You should be free to present whenever you're ready.
Okay. I will share my screen. All right.
Well, that's impressive.
Can you see my screen so far?
I can.
All right. Let me pull up the slideshow. Okay, and I'm going to move you to the corner so I can see my screen a little better. Over here. All right. Good morning, everyone. This is Mary Jimenez with the Department of Water Resources. I'm here plugged in this morning with my colleagues, Steve Cowden and Nathan Pingle. Steve is our DWR lead for the risk analysis update for the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. He's an economist by background as part of our multidisciplinary team. Nathan is logged on today to support Steve in the presentation to expand in a couple of key places and really bolster our explanation of the work. All right, moving on. I'm going to begin today by presenting some background regarding the relevance of the risk analysis update to the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan at a fairly high level before handing off to Steve to do the bulk of the presentation diving into a little more detail in the risk analysis and the update itself. We are going to end with a nod ahead to the future Central Flood Protection Plan engagement and other topics, and make sure we leave plenty of time for questions and dialogue at the end. Starting with some background, as you've probably seen before, we are working under the authorization of the Central Flood Protection Act of 2008, and specifically Water Code sections 9600 through 9625. That is the code that mandated the Central Flood Protection Plan and its updates. But more specifically within the Water Code, the risk analysis relates to meeting the requirement for evaluating flood system conditions and performance that's contained in Water Code section 9614. This is along with the climate change analysis as a package of technical analyses. If you participated in the coordinating committee last month, which I hope many, if not all of you did, you'll recall that the role of the conservation strategy was presented in terms of its contributions to the supporting goals. Steve Cowden's presentation today is on the risk analysis is most closely tied to the primary goal of improving flood risk management, as I mentioned, along with the climate change analyses that we've discussed in more detail at the February Flood Protection Board workshop and other venues. Consistent with how we are working to update the flood plan overall, our approach to updating the risk analysis is building upon our body of foundational work. I've included 3 main takeaways here that I hope that you will all remember. I hope you learn a lot from Steve, but for whatever you can't absorb, please remember the following 3 things on the slide. Along with the climate change analysis, the importance of the flood risk analysis is really that it provides a technical justification for the state system-wide investment approach. The body of work we completed in 2017 in particular highlights the life safety benefits of the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan and the SSIA that are a more direct reflection of the state's priority on public safety and our mission than looking at economic damages alone. And lastly, it's important to update our work every 5 years because these updates reflect changes in flood risk that occur over time. I can pass along to Steve if he's ready.
I'm ready. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah. You're loud and clear, Steve.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Building on what Mary mentioned, you were hoping you learn from the process. I chose this slide to really begin with. Basically, we want to be more explicit with the board and stakeholders up front and through the whole process to understand the risk analysis. That way, hopefully, by the time we're presenting our results, probably around February of next year, we avoid this reaction of how did you get there? So we want to bring you along the whole way. So hopefully avoid or at least minimize this type of reaction. Okay, next slide. What is risk? Basically, something bad could happen. I would imagine that most of us have played this board game of risk. And when your turn comes up, you're trying to make the decision, well, should I invade? Which neighboring country should I invade? What do I gain from it? But what could go wrong? And that leads into the next slide. The risk analysis is asking and answering. What can go wrong? How can it happen? What is the likelihood? What are the consequences? And what can be done about it? So basically, risk is a function of consequence and exceeds probability. And in particular, we're talking about flood risk this morning. So next slide, please. So we're going to be talking about the components of flood risk assessment. It begins with hydrology, where we estimate precipitation and runoff in the watershed based upon our climate assumptions and projections. It involves hydraulics, which estimates flow and stage in the rivers and streams, many of which are regulated with dams. It includes geotechnical engineering to estimate levee performance. It includes economics to estimate flood damages both monetary to structures and infrastructure, as well as non-monetary, loss of life. And it also includes ecosystem to describe expected change in habitat and species viability. Okay, next slide. Stated somewhat differently, the components of flood risk analysis can be divided into these items. The hazard, what causes the harm. So in this case, we're talking about the frequency and magnitude of flooding. Performance, the system's reaction to the hazard. So here we're talking about levee performance, obviously, is the key one, but also we're talking about warning system performance for the life loss analysis. In some instances, the hazard can be modified by the system. For example, the levees will modify the hazard. Another component is exposure, which measures who and what may be harmed by the flood hazard. This includes estimates of the numbers and values of structures, as well as the number of people who are in the hazard area. It includes vulnerability, which basically we use our death damage or death mortality functions to measure vulnerability. And we bring all these components together, we get the consequence, the harm that results from a single occurrence of the hazard. Of course, in our case, we're going to be interested in multiple occurrences of the hazard. Okay, next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, to do a risk analysis, there's a lot of guidance and requirements underlying analysis. And I've got the major ones listed here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you have them here, and you'll get them in the presentation. And they'll be online soon. The key takeaway from all of this is that we want to remain consistent with core methods, which is required. And we have been and will continue to be consistent. So that's the key takeaway from that slide. The next slide. There's also lots of terminology associated with a risk analysis. Here this morning, we're just going to focus on a few terms. Impact areas. Impact areas come from the floodplain. The floodplain is divided into impact areas, which represent areas of similar flooding characteristics and or land use. The river channels are divided into damaged reaches. And each impact area has at least one index point that is to be representative of the hydraulics in the channel along the impact area, as well as the levee failure characteristics for that impact area. So each impact area has one index point. Sometimes they have more, especially if there are streams of different sides of the impact area. Okay, next slide, please. Nathan, I'm going to ask Nathan to kind of describe this slide, which is basically a graphical representation of the risk analysis. So Nathan, take it away.
All right, thank you, Steve. So as Steve mentioned, this is a graphic that shows all the various inputs, mathematical functions that go into computation of flood risk or expected annual damage. So the kind of the long-term average of potential flood damages in the system. We compute this at an index point or impact areas, like Steve mentioned. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about each of these functions and how it was generated for the 2017 analysis and some of the underlying programs and efforts by the department and others to develop this information. So when we look at flood risk, it really is the integration of the hydrology, the hydraulics, the geotechnical, the economic analyses, and pulls it all together. So I'm going to walk around this circle that represents flood risk analysis, starting at the 9 o'clock position. So this is the hydrology. This is kind of we're kind of follow the water through the watershed. So from the rainfall coming down all the way through the water going through the reservoir systems, down the channels and out through the delta. So the first function at the 9 o'clock is the unregulated discharge to probability relationship. This is the hydrology. This information talks about the potential of runoff from the watershed for various annual exceedance probabilities. So this is where we get the underlying statistics, where we look at if we have 3 days of extreme runoff, we can go to this relationship and see what is the probability of that it's maybe the 1%, so 1 in 100 chance of getting a certain amount of volume, precipitation and snow melt in the system and causing the flood hazard. So this information was generated from the Central Valley Hydrology Study, which was an effort, a large study that was completed in about 2012, 2013, in cooperation with the department funded the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to complete that study. It also involved the USGS, FEMA, and so a lot of input from various agencies. It's really the foundation of the flood risk analysis, because it's really relating the amount of volume we could have and the probability of that volume occurring. So once we have that relationship, the statistical distribution, we move to about the 10, 11 o'clock position. This is the unregulated discharge to regulated discharge relationship. And so you can think of this as our flood control system. These are the reservoirs and the bypasses, where once we have this certain amount of volume, this unregulated discharge, what is that? How can we transform that into peak flows in the system? And so this is a representation of how much water could be held in our reservoirs and how we can release that. So in the simple function, what's behind it is large models of the reservoir system with all the flood control operating rules developed by the Corps of Engineers. And so a lot of, and we develop it by simulating a lot of different events through the system. At the 12 o'clock position, we've got our peak regulated flow frequency curve. This is the relationship that tells us, for example, in the Sacramento River near Natomas, what is the probability of a flow of 1% or 0.05%, so 200 year. And so it's from combining the volume frequency curve and that unregulated to regulated discharge relationship. Again, this all comes from the Central Valley Hydrology Study. Moving to the 1, 2 o'clock position, we've got the relationship of flow in the channel to water surface elevation, so discharge channel stage relationship. This comes from models of the channeled system, such as HEC RAS, where for a given flow, we can compute a water surface elevation and take account all the detailed hydraulics and hydraulic complexities in the Sacramento-San Joaquin system. The underlying models information used to develop this channel stage relationship come from the Central Valley Floodplain Evaluation and Delineation effort, also completed about 2012 era. And so that produced very detailed channel models of the entire system. Moving towards the 3 o'clock position, we recognize in the flood risk analysis that levees can fail. Levees can fail to prevent flood damage before they're overtopped. And so we rely on geotechnical evaluations, such as that completed from the urban levee evaluation and non-urban levee evaluation programs, again, joint efforts by the department, the Corps, and many others, to develop statistical relationships of, given a certain channel water surface elevation, what the probability of failure would be. And so these functions were developed by doing a lot of borings through the entire levee system, a lot of modeling to understand that relationship. So through seepage, under seepage, essentially how can the system perform? And And as the water level is higher, how does the probability that a levee could fail increase? And this is another input that is explicitly included in the analysis. When we go to about the 4 or 5 o'clock position, we've got another key relationship. So up to this point, as we move through the circle, we know there's a chance of getting a certain volume in the system, what that might mean to a peak flow in the river, how that peak flow translates to a stage, and how that stage, the probability that water can enter the floodplain, the levee fails. This is that relationship of the channel stage to floodplain stage. And so we developed that for the Central Valley with a lot of detailed floodplain models and two-dimensional models, Flow 2D, HEC RAS. Again, these models came from the Central Valley Floodplain Evaluation and Delineation Program, where we get relationships of if the water is so high in the channel and the levee fails, what are the floodplain depths within at the structures themselves, so the items we're trying to protect. Then we get down to the 6 o'clock position, and this is looking at the consequences. So the floodplain stage and damage relationship. And Steve's going to talk about this a little bit more in the next few slides, but this is a relationship where we gather all the details of every structure in the floodplain in the Sacramento-San Joaquin system. We look at, for various depths of flooding at those structures, how much damage could occur to both the structure and the content, and develop very detailed floodplain stage to damage relationships. And these are developed for every impact area in the system. Finally, we get to the 7, 8 o'clock position, the probability damage relationship. So this is really the result of combining all these other relationships together. So from the probability of the volume to what that means to the reservoir system in the channel, what that translates to a stage, if the stage against the levee could cause it to fail, if it failed, how deep is the water, without depth of water, what that damage might be. That's what this relationship, the annual exceedance probability damage relationship, represents. It also represents some of the flood warning aspects that Steve mentioned too. So it's a really important one. But by combining all this together, integrating under that curve, that's how we get the expected annual damage, which is how we measure flood risk. It's appropriate that this is in a circle, because what we do through CVFEP is look at ways to reduce flood risk. And so if any one of these relationships change in here, we can reduce flood risk, or other factors like climate change could increase flood risk. And so it's appropriate that it's in a circle, that all these pieces fit together. With that, I'll give it back to Steve. Next slide.
Okay, thank you. As part of that circle Nathan talked about, when he was talking about the consequences, one relationship you didn't see on there are depth damage functions. And so here's a kind of an explanation of a depth damage function, which measures the depth at a structure, and depths are referenced to the first floor elevation, and then the damage caused to that structure. And damage is based upon a percent of the total value, which includes structure and content. So at the right, you can see an example. This is from a residential depth damage function developed by the Corps. The Corps has developed a lot of these as FEMA. But basically, you see the relationship between depth and the percent damage, again, based on the total structure value. You'll notice the depth 0 as a damage of 7%. So this depth is measured again at the first floor elevation. So what this is saying, if the water reaches the first floor elevation, you have damage to the foundation underneath it. There must be hundreds of these depth damage functions from all different types of structures for vehicles. We incorporate those into the analysis. Okay, next slide. Okay, this morning we're going to talk a lot of HEC FDA. FDA stands for Flood Damage Analysis. This software was developed by the Hydrologic Engineering Center in Davis to analyze the economic benefit of flood damage reduction projects. It stores all the hydrologic, hydraulic, and economic data information, kind of from those relationships that Nathan just talked about. It also implements core guidance, and they got the key guidance listed there from the core. Back in 2012, CPFPP, DWR adapted FDA to compute life loss, and I'll talk about this in a few minutes. It wasn't really designed to do this, but we adapted it to do that because life loss is a key focus for the state. And the flood risk assessment also follows guidelines described in DWR's handbook for assessing value. Okay, next slide, please. Here we're going to talk about the results when you run an FDA model. The first one I want to talk about is stage damage, and Nathan just talked about this. This is really an intermediate output. This is a stage damage relationship given all the structures in the impact areas, taking into account the H&H, levee failure information, the structure inventory. So this is an intermediate output. Now with FDA, we have an option. We can let the model keep those computations and continue to compute expected annual damage, or we can substitute our own stage damage relationships into the model if we have other information we want to bring into that calculation. And we're going to talk about this for the life loss analysis later on. So we can remember this point, that stage damage, we can replace that. We're going to show how we're going to do that later on. But once we get past stage damage, we get expected annual damage, which Nathan just kind of showed you a graphical example. And that's basically average annual damage in the impact area, taking into account all different types of flooding that might occur. Equivalent annual damage is sort of the average annual damage over your analysis period. So in other words, we have expected annual damage in our base year, we have expected annual damage in our future year, say 2065 or 2072, but we have expected annual damage in all years in between. So this takes into account all those in between, is an average, but also takes into account discounting or the present value of those expected annual damage calculations. Other key outputs from FDA include project performance statistics, including annual exceedance probability or average annual probability flooding at an index point, long-term risk, which is the probability of flooding in 10, 25, and 50-year periods, and conditional non-exceedance, which is basically the flip side. It's measuring the ability to contain specified flood events. In particular, the 100-year event, or the probability to contain the 100-year event based upon your flood system. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now we're going to talk about the 2017 CVFPP update. The risk analysis we did for that. We established a lot of foundational information and procedures that we're going to continue on in 2022, but we just want to start with a review of the 2017 risk analysis, some of the key points anyway. Yep. Next slide, please. We, of course, use FDA for the 2017 analysis. And part of the economics information we input into the model included damage categories. So the damage categories we included then were structures and contents, crops, vehicles, roads and highways, loss of business income, emergency response costs, which include such things as displacement costs, police and fire response, and utility costs. All those categories are monetized. And then the last damage category is loss of life, which is number of persons. We did not monetize loss of life. We have one FDA model for each index point. Next slide. So speaking of index points and impact areas, here are the map of impact areas in the Sacramento River Basin. There's 61 impact areas and 87 index points. You can see the impact areas are represented by the colored polygons. The index points are the dark blue colored points you see on the map. Next slide. Same thing for San Joaquin River Basin. There's 39 impact areas in the basin. We've added 7 for the Stockton metropolitan area. And again, you can see the number of index points, a lot more index points in our impact areas. I should mention that these impact areas were developed back in the comprehensive study about 20 years ago. And we've adjusted them for the 2012 update. We did some more adjustments for the 2017 update, but basically they're the same as developed in the COM study. So I think moving forward, not this update, but the next update, we'll probably need to take a look at these and see if the boundaries should change, especially now that we're incorporating climate change. I would expect those outside boundaries to actually expand, but we're not doing that for this analysis. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, here we're going to get into the specifics of the inputs into the 2017 risk analysis using the risk assessment components that we've been talking about. So for hazard, we used in-channel volume frequency functions that were developed by the CVHS models that Nathan just described. Stage flow relationships were developed by CFED models. Exterior-interior relationships were also developed by the CFED floodplain information. Exterior refers to the channel, and interior refers to the floodplain stages. For performance, the levee performance functions came from the OLI and NULI programs. Flood warning system effectiveness was expert elicitation with NOAA and DWR staff to develop those. Exposure, the structure inventory was based on 2010 parcel cluster information. So for the 2017 update, we did not update the structure inventory, and that is a major focus of this update, but I'll get to that. The vehicles were based on 2010 census information. Crop inventory was based upon DWR county land use surveys. At that time, the DWR land and water use sections would do surveys for maybe half a dozen counties per year. So you may have very recent information for some counties, and some counties it might be like 10 years old, depending upon their schedule for doing those surveys. The population was also based on 2010 census information. For vulnerability, the depth damage functions were standard core depth damage functions. Our depth mortality functions came from the core, more specifically from their HUC flood impact analysis model. Crop damage per acre estimates were updated from 2012, but these originally were developed for the comprehensive study 20 years ago. We've been updating them ever since, and we'll update them for 2022, but I'll get to that. Okay, next slide. So the risk analysis conditions or scenarios that we evaluated in 2017. We evaluated analysis year 2007. In other words, we wanted to take a look at system risk before the state investment. And in particular here, referring to the early implementation program, or EIP. And so for this scenario, we use CVHS hydrology. For fragility curves, we used curves developed prior to the EIP program. The population structure inventory we used for the scenario, we used the 2010 structure inventory. Ideally, when we talk about these structure inventories for all these analysis years, we would like a structure inventory for each to match each analysis year. But most of the time, we don't have that information, so we use something that we think is at least going to be representative. It's close to it. So for 2017, which are basically the current year conditions, the first one there, the 2017 update of system flood risk using CVHS hydrology, post-EIP fragility curves, the 2010 structure inventory. That's basically current conditions without project. Next 2017 is basically the same inputs. However, this represents with project. And here, the only projects we thought that could be done right away would be to enhance the flood response system. So that's current conditions with project. For 2017, our future year was 2067. So the first 2067 future system without project. Hydrology was CVHS, taking into account climate change and sea level rise. We used post-EIP fragility curves. We did not estimate a structure inventory for 2067. However, we developed what we call growth factors based upon population growth for accounting or impact area from 2017 to 2067. If that impact area is expected to grow by 50%, then we would adjust EAD by 50%, move it upwards. We would only do this for impact areas that met urban level protection criteria. And 2067 is also a future system with enhanced flood response, but also construction on the state system-wide investment approach projects. Again, the hydrology is CVHS with climate change and sea level rise. The fragility curves we would change to represent this project fragility curves, and again use the growth factors to adjust the EAD estimates. Okay, next slide, please. We've been focusing so far on pretty much the flood damage analysis. I want to take a couple slides here to talk about life risk analysis and some of the essential elements in a life risk analysis. It begins with the estimate of the initial distribution of people at home, at work, which takes into account time of day, day or night. We also estimate these people based upon, are they under or over 65, because that affects the mortality relationships. But then once a hazard is detected, there's a redistribution of people. Warning is issued. People make a decision if they're going to respond or not. And if they're to respond, how they respond is the evacuation method. Basically, they can shelter in place, they can hop in the car and try to evacuate, or maybe evacuate on foot. Those are some of the kind of key methods we look at. Okay, next slide, please. Along those same lines, on the redistribution of people, a hazard is identified, but there's a delay in communicating the hazard to the emergency management agency. Sometimes it's lost. That agency has to make a decision if they're going to issue a warning, and if so, what type of warning will be issued. So there's more delay involved there. Once the warning is issued, then there's time to get that warning out. If it's electronic warning, probably not a whole lot of time, but if it's door-to-door warnings, then there's a significant amount of time. But in any event, there is a warning diffusion time. Then once that warning is received by the population, or at least the first one, then the population has time to mobilize and take action. And this is the mobilization time, or sometimes we refer to it as a mitigation time, trying to mitigate the perceived problem. Okay. Next slide, please. Other life risk essential elements obviously include the flood characteristics, the depth, the extent, arrival times at structures, and fatality rates is measured by depth mortality functions. Okay. Next slide, please. So for the 2017 update, that particular life risk analysis, we had those mitigation times from the 2012 update, which actually originated with the comp study. So we started the comp study, we've been updating it ever since. We estimated persons per structure under and over 65, then reduced those estimates based upon updated mitigation times. So our demographers and DWR gave us these relationships, persons per structure. We used the mitigation times. The more mitigation times you have, say maybe like 20 hours, will allow more people to leave the structures. If you only have maybe 2 or 3 hours of mitigation times, then fewer are going to be able to evacuate. But regardless, we had those estimates, and we reduced persons per structures to take into account those who may potentially evacuate. Within the FDA model, we replaced the residential structure dollar values, let's don't suggest their persons per structure values. We replace the depth percent damage with the depth percent mortality function. And then we ran FDA to estimate expected annual life loss. So we used all the other information in FDA, the H&H information, the levee failure information, and just made changes to the structure inventory and the depth damage curves. And thus we estimated expected annual loss. So this hadn't been done with FDA, as far as we know. We talked with HSC about doing this, and they were in agreement. It made sense to do this. So we've been doing this ever since, and we did it for 2017. Okay, next slide. Here are the results from the 2017 analysis. These are the life loss results for Sacramento Basin, San Joaquin Basin, with and without projects. You can see all the different values there. We really expect these, at least I expect these to significantly change for 2022 because a lot of the inputs are going to significantly change. And we're going to talk about that right now. Next slide, please. So basically, what's new for the 2022 update risk analysis, comparing to 2017? A lot of things are the same, but there are some key differences, and that's really what I'm going to focus on right now. Again, coming back to our risk assessment components for hazard, the in-channel volume frequency, the stage flow relationships, the exterior-interior relationships will be the same as 2017, except for our future year analysis. We're updating the climate change analyses, and we'll talk about this in a couple of minutes. Performance, our levee performance functions, and our flood warning system effectiveness. We anticipate using the same values here as we did in 2017. However, we are taking a look, reviewing these just to make sure we're not overlooking something that perhaps should be changed. But overall, we expect most of these to remain the same. Now for exposure, the structure inventory, and here's one of our key changes from 2022 compared to 2017. We are using 2019 Land Vision statewide parcel information. That's a huge change there. Vehicles, we're still going to be relying on 2010 census information, although there's updates to that, but we don't have the 2020 census yet. The crop inventory, and here's kind of a significant change here. DWR has started implementing statewide satellite imagery land use surveys rather than the individual county surveys. So we're going to use the latest of those, which was in 2016. So significant change there. Population is still based on 2010 U.S. Census information. However, there are lots of agencies and firms that go through and update that. P-Census is one of those. So we'll be relying on that. And we rely on our DWR demographers to give us this information. As far as the depth damage functions and mortality functions, those are the same as we used in 2017. Our crop damage per acre estimates will be updated from 2017. We finished completing the update. Okay, next slide, please. Continuing with a comparison of 2017 versus 2022. The analysis years in 2017, we used 2007. 2017 was current conditions, and 2067 was the future year. For 2022, we're no longer looking at 2007. We don't need to. We've already done that. So now 2022 will be our current year. 2072 will be our future year. A 50-year analysis period. So we have different years. Our impact areas will be the same. We used in 2017, as our damage categories will remain the same. So no difference there. Number of structures. And you can see in 2017, the number of structures we used was about 350,000 for both basins. Now we estimate for 2022, that's going to be over 430,000. So we've increased these by almost 83,000 structures. And again, remember for 2017, that those estimates were really based on 2010 parcel information. So really, we have a 10-year difference we're making up. So there's this huge difference in the number of structures, which I think will have a significant effect on the results. You can see the crop acres. Crop acres went up. I was a little surprised to see that. crop acres have gone up. There may be a couple factors behind that. One is a different method for measuring crop acres from the satellite imagery from the old DWR on-site surveys. But also there's been a lot of information in the last few years on increasing in the fruit and nut crops and vineyards. So that may be behind that as well. But I have not really done analysis to determine why that went up. Not yet, anyway. Okay, next slide. Continuing with the comparison, 2017 versus 2022, you can see the population estimates. And from 2022 to 2017, we have about almost 70,000 more people in the floodplains. And we're still taking account of future growth. For 2017, we use projections from the 2013 California Water Plan as well as the Department of Finance. For 2022, the latest California Water Plan is still in production, so we don't have those projections yet, but we're relying on Department of Finance projection. So the difference is for 2022, we're relying specifically on Department of Finance and not the California Water Plan. For the flood damage models, we used FDA for 2017. We'll continue for 22. No difference there. For the life loss models, 2017, we use only FDA. For 2022, we are still using FDA. However, we're going to augment that analysis by bringing in inputs from the LifeSim modeling. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, next slide. Okay, here we're going to, a couple of things I have outlined in red in this couple of previous slides. We're going to focus on some of the key enhancements to the 22 analysis, and starting with climate change. So for this, I'm going to turn this over to Nathan to expand upon this.
Thanks, Steve. So the CVFPP has always used the latest science and information to inform the planning study process, the risk analysis process with what the climate change modeling is showing. And 2022 CVFPP will be no different. Kind of in terms of an evolution, back in 2012, we first looked at what climate change might do. And when you think back to this risk analysis circle that I talked about a little while back, really the impact of climate change, especially riverine climate change in terms of runoff, affects that function that was out there at 9 o'clock, that volume frequency relationship. And so what climate change, what the projections are saying is that for the same amount of volume that might occur from rainfall or snowmelt, the big difference is the probability of that occurring changes. So what a certain amount of volume that maybe had a 1% chance occurring because of the warming and the possible additional precipitation that could occur, that probability goes from maybe 1% to 2%. So maybe from a 100-year to a 50-year. And that's where the impact of climate change and how that gets integrated into the risk analysis models. So back in 2012, we said, well, it's more of a what if scenario. At that time, science suggested that there might be a 30% increase in the volume associated with a given probability. And so that was explicitly entered into and accounted for in the risk analysis. In 2017, we looked at what all the atmospheric models and so forth were saying, and looked at a median projection of what that means to change in precipitation and temperature, and folded that into a lot of modeling of the watershed, and developed a median projection volume frequency relationship and folded that into the risk analysis. For 2022, we're taking that a step further. We're using, again, the latest science and modeling, but instead of just looking at the median or best estimate change of how that volume frequency curve relationship might change, we're looking at a range. So we're considering kind of a best case and a worst case. I mean, the best case from little change in precipitation, little change in temperature, versus a worst case where the amount of precipitation we get greatly increases. We have a lot of warming conditions, which causes the snow melt to melt faster, and the water to come down faster and greater peaks in the system. And so the big change is, well, what's the same is using the latest science and the models and integrating that into the risk analysis. The big change here is considering the range, best case, median, and worst case in terms of what those climate projections are showing us and what that means into flood risk within the Central Valley. So I'll give it back to Steve.
Okay, thank you, Nathan. Yeah, another key enhancement for the 22 analysis involves a structure inventory. I remember for the 2017 risk analysis, that structure inventory was based on 2010 parcel information. So now it's 10 years old. So we've known all along we needed to update that. And when we first started thinking about how to update that structure inventory, we contacted the Corps, Sacramento District, and HEC about the possibility of DWR using the Corps' National Structure Inventory, or NSI, which they use nationwide. It's all formatted for their modeling, FDA, and all their other models. So we asked if DWR could use that, and then we were told we could not, because of the parcel licensing restrictions underlying that. However, HSC did tell us that, well, DWR, if you can give us your parcel information, we can take that and we can develop a structure inventory for you that's formatted the same as the NSI, but it's based on your structure inventory, your parcel information, excuse me. So that's what we have done. A couple of years ago, DWR acquired statewide land vision parcel data, which is basically updated quarterly. We gave them the 2019 either winter or fall versions of that parcel information. We gave it to HEC. So they're currently using that to develop a statewide structure inventory for California, or as we call the California Structure Inventory, or CSI. So we're really excited to be able to get this. DWR has never had a statewide, inventory for be used for flood projects. So we anticipate using it not only for CVFP, but other DWR programs. So this is a very significant change from 2017. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the last enhancement I'm going to focus on is on the life loss analysis. Life loss and public safety is a key DWR objective here. So we're always trying to look at how we can improve that analysis. In the last couple of years, the Corps, HEC, has developed a new model, LifeSim, which simulates the life loss, either from dam failures or levee failures, but it's used for flood analysis. And it does a simulation analysis, a GIS-based simulation analysis based upon the flood depths and arrival times at individual structures, whether they're residential or commercial, the population in those structures, the ages of those the population, the time of day, the types of warnings that go out, when people might receive those warnings, and decisions they may make trying to evacuate or shelter in place, the road network that they would evacuate on, the vehicles they would have. So basically, it goes through a simulation analysis to try to estimate the life loss for a single event. So it's a much more robust way of estimating life loss than what we can do using spreadsheets and FDA. Next slide, please. So for 2022, we will run HEC LifeSim for several events to develop a suite of stage life loss functions that will be input into FDA. Remember, we're talking about the outputs, the intermediate output with stage damage. Well, we're going to estimate stage life loss functions and replace those functions and put those functions into FDA. Now, ideally, we would like to do this for all 112 impact areas, but resources and time, we can't do that. So what we have decided is to use LifeSim, these inputs, for the urban and small community impact areas. But really, most of the life losses that has occurred, at least in the 2017 analysis, and there's up to 30 of these impact areas. And by doing this, we'll obviously provide a more robust method to estimate life loss for those impact areas. and more importantly, will be more consistent with the Corps' methods for estimating life loss. However, for the rural impact areas, we'll still rely on the 2017 life loss approach of using the adjusted population assigned to residential structures for structures. However, again, for those rural impact areas, we think that's really a much lesser life loss than we find in the urban or small community impact areas. Okay, right. Next slide. That wraps up the really the presentation on the risk analysis per se. Related topics that Mary wanted me to at least mention.
Oops.
Sorry. That's okay. Regional flood management planning. We expect RFMP engagement to increase as the new contracts are finalized in early summer. For the climate resilience, smaller group discussions on the climate change analysis are ongoing. And Mary will be presenting an update on the conservation strategy to the board this Friday. So with that, that wraps up the presentation. Ready for questions?
So Bill, this is Kim. Seth Wurzel has a question.
Hi, Steve. This is Seth. I know you mentioned that the impact areas were developed during the comp study. Can you describe, or if you know, what was some of the criteria that were used to define those impact areas from that study?
Okay, I'll start, and Nathan, why don't you jump in when I'm done here if there's anything to clarify. Basically, the impact areas, the outside boundary of those impact areas was based upon the composite floodplains, composite 500-year floodplains developed by the comp study H&H work. So based upon that, there were composite floodplains representing the 500-year floodplain for Sacramento, San Joaquin. And then DWR staff got together with Corps staff out of HEC, and we started looking at those and divided them into impact areas that would have similar flooding characteristics, whether it was a ponding flooding, such as in a Delta Island, or overland flow, like in the Calusa area, but also the land use. And particularly, we focus on the urban areas and the small communities like Calusa. And we develop impact areas that just incorporate those urban areas or small communities, because a lot of the flood projects would have to, would be for those small communities or urban areas. So we want to make sure that we were consistent that way. So that would be my response. Nathan, anything you want to jump in on?
Steve, that's the main point. From an analysis perspective, there's a couple considerations of the comp study impact areas were defined mainly by areas of similar flooding conditions and areas that could be divided. And so we also look for physical divides. A lot of times river streams and levees or other physical features can cause the impact area to be divided. And because the area has similar, what we want is an area that has similar probability of getting wet. And so if there's some physical barrier, then that's a reason that could change that probability. The other, some of the reasons, and Steve mentioned land use, is a lot of times we'll subdivide impact areas if we want to consider a flood management solution just to that area. For example, if we want to look at a ring levee, then that would be a reason that impact area is subdivided. So it's basically kind of the physical features, but also kind of planning considerations.
Excellent. All right, thank you.
Okay, Bill, Betty Andrews had a question.
Okay, good morning, Betty.
Good morning.
Betty, this is Kim. We're having trouble hearing you. If you could maybe move closer to your mic.
Yeah, is that better?
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay, great. One of the things that I'm very interested in learning is whether we understand what level of damage avoidance is afforded by the current system. Is that an analysis that has been completed?
What level of damage is avoided by the current system?
Right. Essentially understanding what value we're getting out of the current system. I know we've looked at residual risk, but have we looked at the level of expected annual damages avoided?
We will, try to think about this way to answer this. We'll of course estimate without project damages for our existing conditions, and we can compare them with 2017, but it's not directly answering your question.
Because excuse me, the project, the without project is just saying what damages are with the current system, not with the enhancements, right?
Yes. Yes. So basically, we did this for without project and with project conditions. So when you look at the difference, you focus on the difference.
But we're not. Go ahead.
I'm thinking of the Corps. The Corps has a very specific analysis where they look at the current system and they estimate, well, given this current system, if we didn't have that current system, the damage would have been, X. They go through this exercise, I think, every year. So we don't do that necessarily. Nathan, do you want to jump in on this? Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, that's correct, Steve. The Corps, in terms of their annual reporting, does an assessment every year of damage avoided, but I have not seen that, or that has not been done, or I haven't seen that as a comprehensive analysis in the Central Valley of what would the expected annual damages be without the existing flood control reservoirs and bypasses and levee systems. So that's not an analysis that I've seen done to date.
Yeah.
Bill, actually, I'm going to call on Mike Mearswa because I think he can add some context to this that may help. Mike?
Hey, thanks, Kim. I've been posting in the chat for those of you who are also looking at that. Betty, I think that's a really excellent question. Under the Stafford Act, federal law requires that after an emergency event, that local entities in the state are supposed to conduct loss avoidance studies. And we're not really doing that, and FEMA is aware of that. After the 2017 flood events, we did submit the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan in sort of as a placeholder to stand in and show, hey, that you could look at the without project conditions, just like Nathan and Steve were answering, and infer what some of the value of the present system is in avoiding losses. However, the best work that I've seen is, it was related to the comp study, is 1999, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers released a post-flood assessment, and they specifically went through the 1986, the 1997, the 1995, and I'm forgetting right now what the other flood event was, and literally talked about the system in place, what were the avoided losses, the value of the system for those very specific events. So it wasn't a range of hydrology simulations they went through, but that type of study and report is something that we should be working on building and doing.
Thank you, Mike. I think one of the ways that it could be quite informative to the effort of the department and the board is looking at kind of at a levee flood protection zone area by levee flood protection zone area, because it essentially will tell us what is the value of those different units of the levee system. Because all the analyses you just talked about, I understand those assessments and they're looking at the entirety of the system. But I think if we could look at a granular level at different units of the levee system, we potentially could find some locations where the amount of investment being made in those levee systems is not, doesn't pencil out in terms of the damages avoided that accrue from some of those systems. So that's the piece I feel like we have not had and really need in order to understand how to make wise investments in making improvements to the flood system in terms of the levee segments.
This is
Go ahead.
yeah, this is Steve. But yes, we have the levee flood protection zones. We have those GIS layers for that. I'm thinking that several years ago, the Department of Economic Section and Flood were involved in trying to at least estimate the value of structures and number of people in those levee flood protection zones. It's been a while, so I have to go back and see. But certainly something could be done like that, especially now if we get our statewide parcel inventory or structure inventory, then we can use whatever flood hazard areas we want to delineate in GIS and get that estimate pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
I can see us doing that. Yes.
I think that would be an enormously valuable analysis, just in terms of focusing investments.
Betty, this is Mike. The one thing that I would caution, I mean, because the information's there, and we've had dashboards where we could disaggregate and look at the individual impact areas or levee flood protection zones and see exactly what was happening there for either the probabilistic Monte Carlo simulations you get out of FDA or things that you'd be seeing for the individual scenarios. But we don't know in the future exactly where the storms are going to hit or exactly where the floodwater is going to go. And then when you get into larger watersheds, I mean, it's a very heterogeneous system that the system itself provides value. And so I've always been a little bit guarded in cautioning and going through and breaking things down to splitting it into too fine a detail for the purposes of prioritizing where you should make investments. I'm a big champion of allow the project itself to sell the features that it's doing. So that's the only caution I have out there. I'd hate to say that we're going to prioritize our investments in County A and not put them in County B. And I know that's not what you're suggesting, but I don't want people to leap to that conclusion.
Point taken, Mike. Thanks.
And also add, the analysis we're doing, the risk analysis is for with and with project conditions. We can be looking at the differences in damages and differences in loss of life, for suggested projects, proposed projects, and basically compare those with the costs. So we can do, basically this leads to the benefit cost analysis. So I mean, I would rely on that for or at least in part for the decision making on priorities for the projects.
Right. And the motivation that I have in thinking about this is I do believe that there are some sections of the levee system that aren't really providing enough value to warrant keeping them as part of the project. And we have not confronted how to do, how to actually proceed if the local interests are supportive of taking themselves out of the project. We don't really have a way of looking at where that might make sense. But I just want to suggest that one of the ways that we could look at whether that made sense is if it really is a situation where it takes more to keep the project in place than it's really helping anyone. So that was the motivation for the question.
Okay.
I appreciate that, Betty. And this is Mike, and then I'm going to jump off because this is my presentation. But I want to do two things here is in my new role as a state floodplain manager, getting back to these avoided loss studies and reporting on the value out there, not just with respect to the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan or the Central Valley, but statewide. That is a role that my team is supposed to provide in liaisoning with Cal OES and FEMA. So for any of you that are trying to do this, please keep me and my team in the loop, and whatever resources we have, we can help out there on that. I'm going to do a little pitch here. There is a library of flood models that we have. And as people are doing studies, not just Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, but any type of study out there, as you get the tools, usually there's a way that we can go back and answer those questions. And ultimately, what I like about your question is it's really powerful to people to not just say, here's what did in a Monte Carlo, here's what might happen, but to go back to an event that they might remember where they can see a news clipping and to go through and say, hey, the existing system we had provided this much value. Imagine how much more value you would have if you had additional improvements into the system. And a lot of people really believe that, particularly at the political level, when you're going through and showing the value and benefits in the system. So I see it to be a very powerful tool. And that's why I really pointed out to that 1999 post-flood assessment system, is that we have a pretty poor rundown system that's aging and not performing at peak optimal efficiency. And yet it really provided a lot of protection to people and property in 4 discrete events. That in and of itself, I think, is the key towards really exposing that when we do benefit cost ratios, and I'll get off my soapbox in a minute, we do a great job of coming up with the costs, but we don't spend the money and time to really refine what the benefits are. But when you do a post-flood assessment, you're allowed to actually put in future intensification of benefits because you're taking a snapshot in time. So you get a better job of defining what the benefits were from that loss avoidance study than you do in a traditional Army Corps feasibility study for a benefit cost ratio. And the benefit cost ratio has really been the killer for a lot of what we've been doing across the state and the country for, well, our careers.
Okay, thank you all. Bill, Nathan received a question. I'm going to ask him to repeat the question and then discuss the answer. Nathan?
Okay, thanks, Kim. So the question was, you spoke about latest flood model and application of technology to forecast floods in the system. What is the plan to also use reservoir forecast-informed reservoir operation to manage the flow in the San Joaquin River system as part of this update? So I think I want to make kind of 2 points: that the tools that we are using to do the flood risk analysis are the same tools that are used to evaluate alternative reservoir operation strategies. So these are the same tools that were used as the cornerstone for the Folsom Water Control Manual that evaluated forecast-informed reservoir operations, for example. And it's the same set of tools that are being used by a joint program right now between the Department of Water Resources, Yuba Water Agency, National Weather Service, to look at forecast-informed reservoir operations in the Yuba Feather system. So that said, the tools, well, as a part of this analysis in both the Sacramento and San Joaquin system, and as part of the climate change analysis, is to look at current reservoir operations and how those could be modified along with other flood management alternatives to reduce flood risk in the system and reduce flood flows. So that's something that'll come as part of the reservoir vulnerability analysis as part of this upcoming work.
Thanks, Nathan. I'm going to call on Seth Wurzel. He has a follow-up question.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. So Steve, just how are you allocating your growth projections to the impact areas? Like, how is that being considered?
We've asked our DWR demographers to give us growth projections from 2020 to 2072 for each of the impact areas. So they use their demographics information they have on hand, particularly from the Department of Finance. So based upon that, they give us the existing population, right now, the population expected in 2022 and the expected population in 2072, based on those projections. Now, we do not apply all of those projections for all impact areas. We have to make sure that in order that that if they're to grow, are they meeting the urban level protection criteria? So for urban impact areas, we have to assume that we'll make a determination that with the project, they would achieve 200-year level protection, then they could grow. for the small communities, it's a 100-year level of protection that we're looking at. So I think for the 2017, I forget the exact number, but it's just a smaller number of impact areas that we actually allow to grow, at least in the analysis. We're limited to the urban and small community impact areas that we felt would meet level of protection criteria.
So how does that translate to structure inventory changes?
Okay. We do not estimate a structure inventory for 2022. We will not be estimating a structured inventory for 2072. We could do that, and FDA allows you to do that. And you use their structure modules to do that. You put in an inventory for 2022, and you put in a separate inventory for 2072, and the model uses those to develop the EAD estimates and all the other statistics. We do not attempt to estimate the structured inventory for 2072. We'll not attempt. Basically, what we will do is, if a demographer says that for Sacramento County, the population will increase by 50% between now, 2022, and 2072, then what we will do is we estimate EAD based on the current conditions, either with or without project. Then we take that multiplier, 1.5, and multiply EAD, the current EAD, by a value to get EAD in the future. So what I'm trying to do is adjust the EAD based on those growth factors, rather than trying to estimate the structured inventory in 2072, which for 100 impact areas, that would take a huge amount of time to do. So we're taking this other approach to try to replicate, that type of analysis.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Bill, I don't have any questions in the queue.
Okay, I think this is very important and very helpful discussion. And Leslie, I think the board should have a presentation, maybe a little shorter or summarized at a board meeting, so that all the board members are involved and understand this, particularly those changes that that the DWR is proposing for the the 2022 update. And those changes basically are in the hydrology area, the climate change, and they're going to somehow use Mike Anderson's approach to do some simulations in the small communities and other selected areas, but not a whole change. But they're going to kind of try to take a look at the hydrology. They're going to look at trying to do a little work that's being done now on quantifying the loss of life. And there's a number of issues in the growth area, population, structures, and ag production that they're making some efforts to adjust based on the data they have. I'm assuming that the goal of reaching, a 0.5% annual risk is still the goal that we need to achieve, and the results of this study and looking at the projects themselves will determine where we put the priorities for money going forward, I would assume. But I think this is an awful lot of data, a lot of information, very helpful information, but I think we need to kind of marry, if she and her Steve and Nathan kind of summarize this presentation for a board presentation, I think it would be helpful, because it's essentially the crux of what the 2022 update is going to consider. And people like Joe Countryman and Tim Ramirez and Brian Johnston will all be interested in those issues, I would think.
Yeah, absolutely, Mr. President. I know Michael Wright's on the line right now too, so we can certainly talk to DWR staff about putting that on a future date.
Yeah, I think the key here is to have all the board members be clear on these areas that are going to be adjusted going forward in the plan, in the update. There's some that are going to be partially done. There's some that are going to be really looked at. There's some that they know are going to be need to be adjusted later on, but they're going to do some adjustments preliminarily in this update. But I think it's really important that the board be clear on what's changing from the 2017 update. And I think both Steve and Nathan, as well as Mary, their team did a great job in just presenting that today. Betty's question on what the current system presents in terms of risk avoidance is also critical. But I'm still concerned about whether the goal of ultimately, trying to reach this 0.5% per year risk for the whole system is still the goal of what we're trying to do. And I think that would be important for the board to understand. Is there anything else, any other questions that anybody has? That was an excellent presentation, a lot of good information and data. And we'll need to think about some of these things as we move forward. Oh, yes.
This is Steve. Sorry to interrupt you, but I would refer back to the first slide where the objective is to be more explicit in what you're suggesting or asking exactly along those lines. We want the team must be very explicit with the board and stakeholders as the process we're using. So by the time we get to the end, it's very hopefully fewer questions on what we've done and the assumptions.
Yeah, but they're really important to understand. I'm glad you're proceeding this way, Steve. I just really compliment you for putting that presentation together. That was excellent, I think.
Thank you.
Anything else, Kim or Leslie, on this item?
I don't have anything on this item, Bill. No more questions.
Okay.
I don't see anything either, Mr. President.
Okay, let's move on. Do we have any comments from people on items not on the agenda? Items that you want to see us tackle in the future, or things you've been thinking about?
I don't see any, Bill, but I just encourage people to send me an email. We do have our steering committee meetings where we set the agenda on the first Tuesday of every month. Our next meeting is June 24th. It usually takes at least 3 weeks for people to pull together presentations, and as you can see, a lot of work went into this one today. So thanks to all.
Yeah, it sure did. Okay, we're at important dates on the agenda, and the only thing that's on there is the board meeting that's this Friday, which will be another virtual meeting. And then the last item's the adjournment. I want to express my appreciation to everybody who joined us this morning. It was a good discussion, and we'll get out of here a little bit early. So without objection, this meeting is adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.